Today, we're going to begin our analysis of Daf Dalid Amud Aleph with what seems to be a machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Ravid. And all this is going to kick in with regard to Esei Dochalosas derived from Kilayim B'tzitzis. And according to Rabbeinu Tam, we can have situations where there's no essay, there's no kiyum essay, no one's fulfilling an essay, for example, tzitzis balayla or tzitzis for noshim, and yet Rabbeinu Tam permits the wearing of kilayim, meaning that you can attach tzitzis of tzemer to a beged of pishtan. And the Ravid, in his commentary on the Torah's Kohanim, quotes a shita of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that Nashim Somchos Rishus, that with regard to smicha on a carbon, although women are not obligated to the mitzvah smicha, they have the option to do so. That's called a Rishus. And the Ravid seems to assume that if we were to paskin like Rabbi Yossi, we could apply and extend Rabbi Yossi's principle to the case of a woman wearing kilayim b'tzitzis, because again it's a rishus, but we're allowing a woman to wear kilayim b'tzitzis, even though she's not obligated in the mitzvah, because she can come forward optionally and fulfill the mitzvah. Just like Rabbi Yossi says she can optionally opt for the mitzvah of smicha b'karbanos, so too she can opt for the mitzvah of tzitzis, and therefore it would override kilayim. The Ravid himself paskins like Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda rejects the shita of Rabbi Yossi as far as Nashim Somchos Rishus, and therefore the Ravid's final conclusion, halacha, is that women could not override kilayim b'tzitzis. And that's the Ravid in his commentary on the Torah's Kohen. The Ravid in his commentary elsewhere on Masechet Tamid raises a kasha against Rabbeinu Tam from the sugya here in Yevamot later on at Daf Chav. The Gemara establishes that if there's a case of chayvei lavin, and you recall that we gave that case where an almana, which is always by definition in Yibum, falls for Yibum to a Kohen Gadol, and that's chayvei lavin, the Gemara establishes that on a doraisa level, the mitzvah of Yibum would apply to chayvei lavin, and we would activate the principle of esei dochalosas. And because we have a regular classic lotas in this case, it's not a chiv kares, then why not apply the principle of esei dochalosas? The Gemara then says, which is an amazing principle, that the esei dochalosas only applies to bia rishona. After the first act of bia, he will have to deliver a get. Why? Because we cannot apply esei dochalosas to the second bia, to any subsequent bios, because he's already fulfilled his mitzvah with the first bia. So Rabbeinu Tam says the Ravid is very difficult, because according to Rabbeinu Tam, once you would doche the Iser bia with regard to the first bia, because the first bia has within it a mitzvah of Yibum, so you applied esei dochalosas to that first bia, then we should go on, according to Rabbeinu Tam, and apply esei dochalosas even to the second bia. Just like Rabbeinu Tam says that even in the absence of the kiyum mitzvah, in the cases of Laila, tzitzis balayla, tzitzis for noshim, nevertheless we apply esei dochalosas in bia rishon, bia shniya, even in the absence of the mitzvah of yibum, we should still apply the principle of esei dochalosas. In the language of the Ravid, the Rabbeinu Tam kasha, halo me'achar shenidche iser bia l'tzorech ha-mitzvah, vis-a-vis the first bia, shuv Yesh le'isar alav lipakel legamri. According to Rabbeinu Tam, once we find a dechia halach in this lav, once the lav lends itself to dechia, we can apply the din of dechia, says Rabbeinu Tam, even in the absence of the essay. As long as there's a hechetimtza, somewhere on the face of the globe, we could have essay to be docha this lotas. As the lotas is defined as a lotas that's given to dechia, then we could be docha, according to Rabbeinu Tam, that lotas even in the absence of the kiyum mitzvah. And since with regard to Bia Rishona, we override the lav, Lamazoganov Almana Lotika, that lav now, once it's subject and lends itself to Dechia, according to Rabbeinu Tam's principle, it should be subject to Dechia, even in a case where the essay is absent, namely with regard to Bia Shnir. This is the Ravid's analogy between Bia Shnia in Chayvei Lavin and Kilayim B'tzitzis, where there's no mitzvah of tzitzis. And just like Rabbeinu Tam in the latter case applies the Chia, because Kilayim Nitan L'Chia Eitzel Tzitzis, so too in the first case that we mentioned, the case of Bia Shnia in Chayvei Lavin, Rabbeinu Tam's principle should apply, and we should be able to be docha even in Bia Shnia in the absence of the Kiyum mitzvah, by virtue of the fact that the lav itself in this circumstance is given to the Chiyuv. That's the kasha of the right. Now, the one who comes to defend Rabbeinu Tam against the onslaught of the Ravid is none other than the Shagasari. The Shagasari wants to establish a distinction here and object to the analogy that is presumed by the Rav. And he says the following: Af l'shitas Rabbeinu Tam, with regard to Kilayim, you're making a mistake. Lo hutara isur. Even Rabbeinu Tam would agree that you cannot be matir isur Kilayim, ella kol zman sha mitzvah kayemes, as long as the mitzvah is still somewhere in the world. V'aheter chal gam b'makom sheino mekayem es mitzvah, aval mikol makom shayeches mitzvah zu legabe acherim v'chefza zeh. With regard to this chefza of kilayim b'tzitzis, although at night or in the case of an isha there's no kiyum mitzvah, but the beged itself, the chefza of the beged, lends itself to the kiyum mitzvah. Tomorrow with daybreak we'll apply the mitzvah of tzitzis. And in the case of a male, he putting on the same beged would be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis. So that we have, even at this moment in time, the possibility of an esed, albeit eitzel acherim. But since the scenario in its abstract form lends itself to the chiyah, even right now, although during the night, or if she cannot be docha because she doesn't have the mitzvah, but will apply to chiyah because the chefta and the Yisur Kilayim is in the parsha of the chiyah, even now, klapi acherim. Masha Enken, he says, in the case of the Yibum of Chayvei Lavin, after the Bia Rishona, there's no mitzvahs Yibum at all. This woman is not in the parsha of Yibum, and therefore, even Rabbeinu Tam would say that now this lav is no longer nitan leheter al yidei dechiyah. After the Bia Rishona, the lav of Almana l'kohen gadol doesn't lend itself to any sort of a dechiyah, because the mitzvah of Yibum has already been fulfilled. Finito. There's no possibility anywhere on the face of the earth that there would be a kiyum mitzvah of Yibum. There's no chefza that lends itself to Yibum b'makom acher. And therefore, it's not comparable to Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam sees in the case of kilayim b'tzitzis, even b'layla, or even on the part of a woman, that the chefta, the beged, lends itself to the mitzvah. It's a perfectly good pair of tzitzis, if only it was daytime, if only it was a male who was obligated. We would certainly apply dechiyah. So even as it is right now, we see the potential of dechiyah, says the Shaksari. Masha Enken, in the case of the Sugya Daf Chav, which is the Ravid's proof, what shaykhs, what potential of Kiyuv Mitzvahs Yibum is there once the Bir Rishona has already taken. And finally, to end this discussion about Kalayim B'tzitzis, which we've been dwelling on now for a few days, I want to end with an insight of the Beis HaLevi, of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Brisker, the original Beis HaLevi. The Beis HaLevi wants to defend Rabbeinu Tam against a different objection to the Ravid. And this is the Ravid al HaRambam. And we're looking at Hilchas Tzitzis, Perek Gimel, and there's a Gzeira D'Rabbanan with regard to Sadin B'tzitzis. We don't allow putting tzitzis on a linen garment, even though the Torah allows that, but the Rabbanan made a Gzeira. What were they afraid of? We're afraid that he will use this beged and continue wearing it into the night when there's no mitzvah of tzitzis. And that's codified here by the Rambam and other poskim. And now we have a real problem according to Rabbeinu Tam. Because in the worst case scenario, if he continues to wear this beged, sheish ba kalayim with tzitzis, at night, there's no problem. We're going to apply the principle of Dechiyah, even in the absence of the Kiyuv Mitzvah B'Layla. So why are we worried about, a beged shel pishna with tzitzis during the day? Because he might continue to wearing it at night. Comes along the Beis HaLevi, and he says the following. We have a comment of the Ravid on another Rambam. The Rambam that we quoted before was in Perek Gimel Halacha Zayin. If we fast forward 2 halachos, the halacha tests, the Rambam writes that Noshim ba'avodim sherotzu l'satik b'tzitzis mis'atfin below bracha. And the Ravid makes the following comment. When the Rambam permits a woman to wear tzitzis, as long as she doesn't make a bracha, says the Ravid, Ein ze'el b'tzitzis she'ein ba kilayim. That means it's not a beged shel pishtan, because that would be a beged she'esh ba kilayim, and with regard to a woman, we have no mitzvah of tzitzis, therefore there's no esei dochalosas. She's going to be stuck with a violation of kilayim, so we really have to restrict the Rambam's leniency, so to speak, as allowance for a woman to wear tzitzis to a case where there's no kilayim by mixing tzitzis with a beged shel pishtan. And everybody from the Shagasari and on derive from this Ravid that the Ravid rejects Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam was the one who said that Kilayim b'tzitzis is mutter even for a woman. Ravid is clearly saying that's not so. Here we want to introduce a chiddush atzum of the Beis HaLevi. The Beis HaLevi says the following, that I'll just read to you the language, and then he says, "Lo Omer ben Tal v'beged isha mechliv b'tzitzis mutar af leisha, aval gam l'daito asur isha lahatil beged shelo tzitzis sheish bo kalayim, kmo ksus hamidzuka b'layla sheish bo isa kalayim af l'Rabbeinu Tam kilei kalayim." The Beis HaLevi makes a very, very sharp revolution by saying that Rabbeinu Tam, when he allows you to wear a beged shel tzitzis, which is made of pishtan, a lilo, that's only in a case of what's called a ksus yom, but not in a case of ksus lila. I always give you the example of pajamas. Okay, whatever word you want to use for ksus laila, it's miyuchad for laila, nightwear, as opposed to daywear. Where does Rabbeinu Tam allow tzitzis on a beged shel kilayim even at night? And despite the absence of the kiyum mitzvah of tzitzis at night, nevertheless, we're going to apply the principle of Esei Dochalos. That's only because the beged itself is a beged yom. And if it's a beged yom, it's a hefza of mitzvah tzitzis. And Rabbeinu Tam says, leave out the kiyum agavra, that's not relevant. All we need is a hefza shel mitzvah tzitzis in order to apply Esei Dochalos. So we can apply Esei Dochalos to a ksus yom alayla. Therefore, if, says the Beis Halevi, you had a ksus laila and you wanted to add tzitzis to a beged shel pishnon of a ksus laila, even Rabbeinu Tam would agree that that's a violation of the Yisur Kalayim. We cannot allow that because there's no essay to be dochalos aseh. Even in the chefts of the beged, this chefts shel beged as a ksus laila never ever is in the parsha of tzitzis. So it's a whole new interpretation and a limitation in Rabbeinu Tam's chiddush. Says the Beis Halevi, if you accept what I say, given my premise, I can now reconcile the Ravid with Rabbeinu Tam. And even though the Ravid warns us that in the context of the Rambam allowing women to wear tzitzis, says the Ravid, that's only if it's a beged she'ein ba kilayim. But if it has kilayim, meaning it's a beged shel pishnon, then we cannot allow a woman to wear this. And we assumed, like the Shagas Aryeh, that this is against Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam certainly allows a woman to wear a beged shel kilayim with tzitzis. Says the Beis Halevi, no, this is not against Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam would certainly agree that if this beged is a beged shel isha, it's female wardrobe, it's a female wardrobe beged, then you would not apply the mitzvah of tzitzis to be docher kilayim because this beged is never ever chayav in the mitzvah tzitzis. There's no inherent potential chiv tzitzis inherent in the beged because the beged shel isha. Rabbeinu Tam would agree, and for that matter, the Ravid would also agree that if it was a beged shel ish, or let's say it was unisex, right? It could be for both men and women. Therefore, if a man wears it, he's chayav in tzitzis. If a woman wears it, she's part of tzitzis because a woman is always part of tzitzis. But now, Rabbeinu Tam and even the Ravid would agree that despite the fact that it's a beged shel pishnon, and there'll be kalayim in this beged, since it's a beged ish, and it lends itself bechefta to the mitzvah of tzitzis, then she can wear this beged without having any issues and any inhibitions regarding kalayim. And we will apply Esei Dochalosa because we now have a chefts of a beged that inherently lends itself to the mitzvah of tzitzis. Masha enkein a beged shel isha. That's where the Ravid said, no, we cannot allow her to wear kalayim in a beged shel isha because that beged is mufkat, completely excluded from the mitzvah of tzitzis. It could never generate a chiv tzitzis. And if that be the case, then Rabbeinu Tam and the Ravid are saying the same exact, very radical chidush of the Beis Halevi. Now, at this point, what we want to do is we want to go back to the Gemara on Daf Daled. And we're going to learn again about smuchim. And if you recall, at the top of Daf Daled over Aleph, we derive from the smichas haparshios of kilayim and tzitzis that kilayim does not apply in the case of tzitzis. And the last Gemara that we did was Amar Abelazar Smuchim and Atorah Minayin Shenemar Smuchin la'ad li'olam asuyim be'emes liyosh. Fine. We're up to Omar Rav Sheshes. So you may recall, let's just get the place. We're 4 lines down from the top on Daf Dalet Amud Aleph. That Rav Sheshes is going to come up with a scenario in which the Yevamot can refuse to comply with the mitzvah of Yibum, to apply the mitzvah of Yibum, and would compel the Yavam to deliver Chalitza. And that's the case of Mukas Shchin. And Rav Sheshes, in the name of Rav Lozman, is going to derive this from Smichus HaParshas. Minayin liyavama shenafla lifnei Mukas Shchin. She doesn't want she doesn't want to agree to a mitzvah of Yibum with a Mukas Shchin. How do we know that she can refuse? And we will coerce the Yavam to deliver Chalitza. The answer is, She'ein chos minosa, we will not close her mouth and muzzle her when she has a valid claim. She doesn't want to be married to this Mukas Shchin. Derived from Smichas HaParshil, Shenemar, Lo Sachsam Shor B'disho V'samach Le, Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav, etc., the mitzvah of Yibum. So even though as a general rule, we don't ask a Yevama and listen to what she says, whether she agrees to the Yibum or doesn't agree to the Yibum, the ball is totally in the park of the Yavam. He will decide, but the exception to the rule, Lo Sachsam Shor B'disho, is in a case of a Mukas Shchin. Now, if you take a look at the beginning of the wide lines in Tosfos, there's a Tosfos Dibur HaMaskil V'chi. And Tosfos addresses a very interesting issue. You know, with regard to Alfusos, there's got to be a hierarchy. What that means is that very often we find that there's a contradiction between 2 Yalfusos, and they'll come to different conclusions, mutually exclusive. You can have a Kal V'chomer against the Binyan Av. You can have Smichus HaParshios against the Kal V'chomer. In this case, Tosfos says, we're going to ask the question, which is greater, a Smichus derivation or a Gzeirat Shavah? And Tosfos has a sugya in Sanhedrin on Daf Samach Zayin, and he proves from that sugya that Gzeiras Shavah Adifa is powerful and trumps Smichus. So that if you could derive from Smichus one conclusion and from Gzeiras Shavah the opposite conclusion in such a head-on collision, we will prefer and tip the scale in favor of the Gzeiras Shavah. Where do we see that? In the Gemara in Sanhedrin. So this Gemara is about the relationship between what's called Ov V'Idoni and Machashefa. And the Gemara wants to know, and this is going to be a machlok between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, what is the punishment for a machshefa or a machashef, male or female? Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds, I should say both Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva hold that the capital punishment to be meted out for a machashefa is skila. But the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva is how do we derive that conclusion? Whilst Rabbi Yossi Aglili derives it from a Gzeira Shava. Rabbi Akiva, sorry, Yossi Aglili derives it from. Okay, the names are, I'm not sure exactly how important this is, but let's just get it straight. Both Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva have a Gzeirah Shava. The trouble is they have two different Gzeirah Shavas. The Gzeirah Shava of Rabbi Yossi, we're not going to go through all the details of the sugya, produces the following conclusion, that the punishment for a machashev is sayif. Rabbi Akiva has a different Gzeirah Shava from which he derives the conclusion that the punishment for a machashev is skila. Ben Azai has a smichus haparshis. So Tosa says the following. We don't know that Rabbi Akiva rejects the concept of darshan smichus, which we find all over the place, all over Shabbos. The reason why Rabbi Akiva pushes aside the drush of smuchot of Ben Azai, says Tosfos, is because adifa gzeira shava bismuchot. Rabbi Akiva would prefer a gzeira shava to smuchot. So the gzeira shava Rabbi Akiva teaches that a machashev is chayav skila. Rabbi Yossi Aglili has a different gzeira shava, and his gzeira shava teaches that the punishment for a machashev is sayif, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili prefers a gzeira shava over smuchah. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we go through the next line in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Omer Av Yosef, Afil Lamandi Omar de lo dar smuchim bi alma, the Mishnah Torah darsh, dar Rabbi Yehuda bi alma lo dar smuchim, uve Mishnah Torah darsh. The Gemara is making a fundamental distinction. Again, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure the logic out. But the Gemara differentiates between the first four books of Moses and the last book of Moses. With regard to the first four, Rabbi Yehuda rejects the concept of smuchim. There's no valid derivation that you can derive from smuchim, but he agrees that in Mishnah Torah, we are dorish smuchim. Now, the Gemara is going to try to prove at this point that Rabbi Yehuda in Kalatar Kula does not darshan smuchim, and Ubialma Minolan Delodarish smuchim. How do we know that Rabbi Yehuda does not have? He's not on board for the drush of smuchim. The Sanya, we have a brisa. Ben Azai Omer Nemar. It says it's Shmos Perikov Beis. Mechashefa lo sechaya, doesn't say how you put it to death. V'nemar in the very next pasuk, it says kol shochev behema mos yumos. Smocho inyan lo ma shochev behema beskila af mechashefa beskila. So again, the first pasuk here is machashefa lo sechaya, and it's unclear what is the death penalty, death sentence for a machashefa. The next pasuk is shochevim behema mos yumas, and the Torah therefore, by placing the parsha of machashefa next to the parsha of shochevim behema, is going to teach us something. Ma shochevim behema beskila. And this we know from another parsha. The Torah says, "V'isha asher tikrav al kol behema l'rav osa, ve'arad asa isha v'esabehema mos yumsum d'meim bam," and d'meim bam means skila. So there's no question that in the case of a woman who has an act of bestiality with a beast, she gets skila, and we assume that if a man would have the same kind of shochev and beima, he likewise would be chayav skila. And the pasuk called shochev appears in the Torah immediately following the pasuk of machashefa lo sechaya. So therefore, just like shochev and beima is chayav skila, so to machashefa gets skila. So that's the drush of smuchim of Ben Azar. Omar lo Rabbi Yehuda says to Ben Azar, Indians low. Notzi zel skila. You're going to be machayev a machashev skila based on smichos haparshios. And now Rabbi Yehuda substitutes a different drasha to teach us that a machashefa gets skila, not from the smichas haparshios to shochim and behema, but rather the ov v'yidoni. Ov v'yidoni b'chlal machashefim hoyu. If the Torah had not singled out ov v'yidoni, they would be included under mechashefa. We would know that ov v'yidoni, since the machashefim, they also have to be put to death. Lama yatsu. Why did the Torah? And here we're fast forwarding to Vayikra Chav. Yatsu, and the pasuk says, "Isha isha ki yebahem ov o yidoni mos yumsu, but even yirgemu osam tveim ba." Why did the Torah have to bother singling out ov yidoni? They would be naturally, we would assume they're included under machashefa lo sechaya. And the answer is lahakish lahem, to make a hekesh between ovi doni and all machashefim. There's a generic concept of machashefim. Lomar lecha, to teach you ma ovi doni beskila, right? As it says explicitly, yirgemu ba'em and yirgemu osam. Af, so to call machashefa misasa beskila. So this is how Rabbi Yehuda derives the conclusion that a machashefa is chayav skila, not from the smichos haparshios to shochev and behema, which was Ben Azai's derivation, but rather from ovi doni. So the Gemara concludes on this basis that Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchin. Because if he darshan smuchin, then why would he reject the drasha of Ben Azai of smuchin? And now we're ready for the catch of Tosas. Tosas says, how do you know that Rabbi Yehuda rejects smuchin? After all, we had Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and he derived a conclusion with regard to machshefa from Gzeirah Shava. Ma hochicho Shmi Rabbi Yehuda she'ein adorit smuch b'chol Torah le yitachin shemishum ha'gzeira shabbos Rabbi Yossi ha'glili. Therefore, he rejected this drush of smuchim, and therefore he needed the hekesh to ovidoni in order to establish that the misa of a machshefa is skila. So again, let's just summarize the kasha. Our Gemara proves that Rabbi Yehuda rejects smuchim from the fact that he did not accept the drush of smuchim of Ben Azai. Says Tosfos, we have a principle that if there's an option of Gzeres Shava or smuchim, we opt for the Gzeres Shava. It's more powerful than smuchim. So how do you know that Rabbi Yehuda in principle doesn't dash in smuchim? Maybe he does. But in the case of machshefa, we have Gzeres Shava, and therefore we're not going to apply the principle of smuchim. But that doesn't mean that necessarily that Rabbi Yehuda rejects smuchim. The Tosfos says that the whole sugya is built on a nuance, a flavor, so to speak, of the Gemara and the language of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says to Ben Azai, "V'chi mipnei shesamchu inyan zeh notzi zel eskila," as if to say, why are you basing yourself on smuchim? Smuchim is not a source or a basis in the first Baruch Moshe, at least, for deriving halachic conclusion. The whole Gemara is based on a diuk, a subtle, meticulous reading of the choice of language of Rabbi Yehuda as recorded in this brisa. And that language says Tosfos, indicates that he doesn't have the klal of darshaning smuch. Okay. Now, take a look for a moment here at Rashi. Can't find the Rashi. Oh, here it is. 3 lines down from the top. Elakofin oso v'cholitz. Rashi says that from the smichus between Lotachson and Yibum, we're going to derive the conclusion that under the very unique circumstance of Ukashkin, we will compel the Yavam to be cholitz. Underline those words. Elakofin oso v'cholitz. Now, let's add 2 major points. First, Rashi later on Daf Lavetes Amid Beis, where this sugya is brought down, says Lav Dafka Mukashkin, Elahu Adin B'chol Taina Shemachmasa Eino Rotza L'Syamin. If she can come up with some claim that's worthy, that's understood, we can objectify it. Why she doesn't want to marry this Yavam, then the law is kofinos alach. So Rashi has 2 chidushim. Number 1, that if she has a taina that for which reason she doesn't want to be misyabi, number 1, we will force the yavam to give chalitza. And number two, another chiddush of Rashi is that it's not limited to mukashtin. Don't get the wrong impression, says Rashi. It's any taina that she can come up. Below taina klal, if she has no claim whatsoever, she just says, you know what, I'm not interested in yibum, then she'll be compelled to submit to yibum, to allow yibum. Now Rashi later on in the Sugya on Daf Lametes with regard to Mukashkin, Rashi quotes a Gemara in Ksubis on Daf Ayin Zayin, which tells the following story. Maisa Betsaidon Bebursa. He was a merchant who sold hides. That's a smelly business. And then he died, and his wife fell for evil. Amru Chachamim, Afal Pisha Haisa Nisuad Achshav Lebursi, Yechola Lomar Leyavam, Esachicha Yisi Yechola Lekavel, Avol Oscha Eini Yochol Lekavel. So Rashi says the following. We're talking about a bursi, we're not talking about a mukashtin, and she doesn't like the job that he's dedicated to, even though she was married to a bursi, to a socher oros. And I guess it was a family business, and the Yomim is in the same business. She has a right to say, you know what, your brother I was married to, I'm going to add a little romance here. She fell in love with him and she married him. And I can tolerate him, but I don't want to tolerate you. And the Gemara establishes, says Rashi, that even such a claim is accepted, and we will force the Yavam to deliver chalitza. That's a sugya on Daf Ayin Zayin. This is another sugya earlier on Samach Daled. Kosvin Igeres Merid al Arusa, V'ain Kosvin Igeres Merid al Shomeres Yavam, which means that we have halacha moredes, and she forfeits her ksuba. And once the Eidim testify that she was a moredes, then we have a right to write up a shtar and give it to the Baal so that he can prove that he doesn't have to pay up the ksuba. She's a moredes. But in a case of Shomeres Yavam, if she doesn't want to submit herself to agree to Yibum, she does not have a din, a status of a moredes. So Shomeres Yavam Yechol Lomar Any Rotzel L'Syamin, and she's not a moredes. She doesn't lose her rights to the ksuba. And all this, as Rashi, is derived from Smichos HaParshios, because it says Lo Satsam Shor B'Dicho, and then the Mitzvah Yibum. And even in scenarios where we're not talking about Mukashchin, in fact, we're talking about a bursi and she was married to a bursi, she could say, I don't want to marry the Yavam, he's a bursi. Or in terms of whether she's a moredes and she forfeits her ksuba, the Gemara says she's not a moredes when she says, I don't want to be misyamin. And all the Rishonim seem to reject this Rashi. Reject Rashi Ramban. They all say no. This whole the entire halacha of lo tachsam shor b'disha that gives a right to demand chalitz only applies to mukashchir. Shar tainos einon mo'ilos lo chufo lachos. Any other possible claim that she has to reject Yivu would not be effective to force Beis Din, to force the Yavam to deliver Chalitza. The story of the Bursi. Bursi is the same as a Mukashchin. And how do I know this? How does Tosfos know that Bursi equals Mukashchin in this context? Because the halacha is that if a man is married to a woman, and as life would have it, he turns out to be a Bursi, those are grounds for her to demand a divorce. You can't prove anything from a Bursi. Because the halacha is that even if a man is married to a woman, she can demand a divorce if he becomes a Bursi. And therefore, Bursi is the most, it's repulsive. It's something that is equal to a Mukashchin and will accept her tiny. Don't prove from the Gemara in Ksubas, in Ksubas Zayin, and the story of the Bursi, that a woman, a Yavama, can come up with any taina whatsoever and say, I don't want to submit myself, I don't want to agree to be partners to this Yavam, and demand Chalitza. No. Says Tosfos, Ramban, and others, that halacha, which is derived from the Smichas HaParshiyos, only applies to a Mukashchin or a Bursi who has the same status as a Mukashchin or Raya, that even within the context of a regular marriage, she can claim these are grounds for divorce because he became a Bursi. And Tosfos says we have a principle called mitzvahs. Oh, I'm sorry. What I mean to say is the Torah prefers Yibum, but after Abba Shol, he made a takana that mitzvahs chalitza kodemes lemitzvahs Yibum. The Ramban therefore comes to the conclusion that if a Yavama declares lo nichali b'yavam, mafsida esk subasa v'dina kimoredes. V'rak im nafla lefnei mukashchin as ein chos minosa. V'yesh la ksuba. So this is a very fascinating issue in the context of the mitzvah of Yibum and her rights to reject Yibum and force him to give a chalitza. We've laid the groundwork, the first level for the main sugya on Daf Chav. And now we're going to mention a tshuva of the Maram ben Baruch, which is quoted in another sefer called the Tshuvas Ranach, and they're all quoted by the Beis Yosef in Eben Ezer, Simon Kuf Samach Vav. He says that the reason why, in the case of Mukashchin, we force the Yavam, the Mukashchin, to deliver Chalitza, is Kidei Shalola Anga, that she shouldn't be an Aguna. She doesn't want to marry him, and she can't marry anyone else without Chalitza. But, says the Maram, there's another element in the equation, and that's called Kofin Oso midin kfir ala mitzvahs. In other words, we have a principle in general of kofin ala mitzvahs, and that's going to apply here in the case of chalitza. So since she has a right to say she doesn't want yibum, now there's an alternative mitzvah, which is chalitza, and the Torah requires chalitza. And we have a principle of kofin ala mitzvahs. If he refuses to give a chalitza, we'll beat him up. And now, based on this tshuva of the Maram ben Baruch, we have a bunch of other tshuvas much later on in the Parshas Mordechai. He quotes the Emek Yoshua, Emek She'ela, She'afim shneim einam rosim lachlos v'lo liyavim. Supposing neither of them are interested neither in chalitza nor in yibum, kofin osam ala chalitza. So again, we're not going to force them into yibum, but we can force the Baal, the Yavam, to deliver chalitza. Why? Because the Torah commands the Yavam in the midst of chalitza in event that there's no yibum, and kofin ala mitzvahs. And is there a Rishon that disagrees with this tshuva, the Maram ben Baruch, that some Sofer claims it's none other than the Rambam? He looks at the Rambam in the second chapter of Mitzvahs of Hilchas Yibum, and he says, Mashma Rambam she'ein hachalitza mitzvah. Chalitza is not a mitzvah unto itself. Ela ba rak kedei lahatira linase lezar. But if she says, I'm not interested in chalitza, that's fine. So this is a fascinating discussion. Is there a mitzvah of chalitza? And then Nafkamina is going to be in a case where neither of them are interested, neither in yibum nor in chalitza, but there's halach of kofin ala mitzvahs. And we see on the one hand, the Chuvas Maram ben Baruch maintains that there is a mitzvah of chalitza. The Rambam, on the other hand, says that there's no mitzvah of chalitza. Chalitza is only an option as a legal enterprise to be matir her to the shuk. So I just want to mention the Beis Shmuel here only because it fascinates me. I don't know if you'll be interested. The Beis Shmuel, who's the super commentary on Shulchan Aruch Even Ezra, and here in this case Siman Kuf Samach Hey that we mentioned earlier, he writes that he found a Zohar, and from the Zohar he derived the conclusion that there's a mitzvah of chalitza. So the Chaim Sofer says, we're not going to force a person, in this case the Yavam, to fulfill a mitzvah based on his Zohar. Ein lachuf es hayavam al chalitza mishum divrei hazohar. And in order to prove his point, he invoked a Beis Yosef elsewhere. I don't know exactly where this Beis Yosef is. That if there's a machlokas between the poskim and the mekubalim, and the mekubalim are basing themselves on the Zohar, ein lachuf, we cannot get involved in such a case and force a person lasos in divrei hakabbalah. So to force a yavam to deliver chalitza when she's not even asking for it, based on a kabbalah from the Zohar, that we can't do. We don't know that chalitza is a mitzvah. And therefore, we don't know if we can apply the principle of kofin ala mitzvahs. You can tell me, well, the Zohar says it is a mitzvah. That doesn't allow us to be kofa a person, to force a person to fulfill the mitzvah of divrei Kabbalah. Kabbalah meaning mysticism. Then the Chassam Sofer claims that the Beis Shmuel did not interpret the Zohar correctly, and Ein Zu Mitzvah Saseh, and the Zohar agrees there's no Mitzvah Saseh of Chalitza, El Sgula L'Nishmas HaNiftar. It's not a mitzvah, but inherent in the Chalitza is something that really, it upgrades the Niftar, the other brother who died without children. All right, so maybe we should force him. She, the Yevama, lost her husband, and there's some sort of skula for the nefesh of her husband through chalitza. So wouldn't it be a great chesed? She's representing her late husband, and force him to do chalitza. And the Chassam Sofer answers this question with a very fascinating chidush. If a man dies, who's obligated to bury him? I'll give you two choices. We have a list of his closest relatives, and we have his wife. I mean, this could be a tremendous nafkamina, because kvura, again, here in Israel it's a little bit better, but in general, kvura could cost. I remember after my father-in-law passed away, we had to decide where to bury him. There were two parts of one long cemetery. One part had bells, Hasidic bells, and the other part had Jews from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They had what's called a Landsmannschaft. My father-in-law was a member of the Landsmannschaft. He paid dues to the Landsmannschaft in the Lower East Side. And that gave him free rights for burial in that section. And there were others who wanted to bury him in the Belzer part. He never bought a chelik in Belz, even though he was a Belzer chassid. So to me, it was a davar pasha that we should bury him with his other landsman. He paid dues, and he had free rights for a burial plot. And he never bought a plot in Belz, but it was such a division of opinion. I mean, in that very short period of time. And there were members of the family that was, Hesa Belzers, as you say, and they insisted that we bury, that he would definitely be happy if it's going to cost home to our phone. I don't remember exactly. I think it was $10,000, or maybe twice that amount. I don't remember. The burial in Belz to buy a plot. This is out in Yehupitz, by the way. And at the end, they decided to turn to my mother-in-law, and she would make the final decision. She actually decided to bury him in Belz. Her parents were Belzers, his parents were Belzers, for generations. But she wanted him to be buried in Belz. That was a very expensive decision, just in terms of monetary money. Is she obligated to bury him? So the Chassam Sofer says no. The obligation of burial is incumbent upon other members of the family, not on the wife, on the widow. You're saying that the mitzvah of chalitza is a chesed to the niftar. What could be a greater chesed to the niftar than burial? And yet we can't force her to bury her husband. So what position does she have to force the yavam to deliver chalitza l'chvod the niftar, her late husband? I mean, if she's not obligated and we cannot compel her to bury her husband, how much more so we cannot compel the mitzvah of chalitza? V'hosif sheme'azor atzmo muchrach minei udbei she'ein kofin al chesed zeh. He has a proof, I have a proof, says the Chassam Sofer, that for this chesed to the niftar, we're not going to force the yavam to deliver chalitza. Sherei kosav, she'ein manoach l'nishmas hames ad sheteled ha'yavama ben layavam shikar al shmo, o al yidei chalitza. B'im kofin al tikun zeshal ames nimtza she'im yiu hayavam vayavamas kenim she'enu ru'im laholid v'ein b'yavimtam mishum tikun l'nishvas hames yesh lachem v'osam dafka lachlots v'lo that in an elderly couple where she's beyond, children-bearing age, we're going to have to force chalitza. Why? Because there's no chesed for the mess through yibum. There's no possibility of having a child. The only alternative, says the Zohar, is chalitza. So now we're going to force the Yavam to give chalitzas. Why? Because they're older? We never found that in halacha. So obviously, there's no option of kfir, despite the fact that somehow the chalitza gives an aliyas neshama to the mess. Okay, so this is where we're going to stop for today. Again, we have a lot more to discuss here about. We still have Kilayim B'tzitzis, and we'll have Esei Tovalosas, and we'll have Smuchin in the first 4 books, Smuchin in Mishnah Torah, a contradiction between a Gzeira Shava and Smuchin, and the discussion about Chalitza. Do we force Chalitza? Do we not force Chalitza? In the case of Mukashrin, in other cases, how broad of a scope does she have in rights to make a taina? And we apply the principle of Lotas. Let me wish you a great day.